Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar in a Strange Land presented by Alex Shendelman. I'm Alicia, and I will be moderating today's event with Lenka. We will be monitoring the chat and Q&A box. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we begin. First, this event will be recorded and available on our website, but don't worry, you won't appear in the video, and your audio will be muted during the events. We cannot see you and we cannot hear you, and none of that will be recorded. So you're just attending and having a good time. You can communicate with moderators through the chat during the presentation. If you have any questions for our presenters, please type them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of the control panel. Closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. The presentation will be around 45 to 50 minutes, followed by a 10 to 15-minute Q&A. We will try to get as many questions in as we can, but if we don't get into your questions, please email us at programs@abmf.charity, and we will be sure to get back to you. We will be sending a link to the recording as soon as it's available after the webinar. You can also go to our YouTube channel to access the past webinar recordings. Before moving forward, I would like to say a few words about the Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation and introduce today's speaker. Diane Boca created ABMF to honor the life of her daughter, Ashley Boca, by helping others in their mental health journey. Ashley was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and lost her battle shortly before her 32nd birthday. Diane does not want others to have the same outcome as Ashley. The Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation believes that everyone should have access to the mental health support they need when, where, and how they need it. We offer support and educational services to those that are struggling with BPD, as well as the broad spectrum of mental illnesses associated with BPD. And we support their loved ones. Visit our website at www.abmf.charity to learn more. Our speaker today is Alex Shendelman. He is the program manager in the Survivor Support Program, part of the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. His focus since 2003, first as a volunteer and then as a program manager, has been to help create a community of support for survivors of suicide and homicide loss. The program provides individual and group supports after a suicide or homicide loss. We are honored to have you here with us, Alex, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm just going to quickly share my screen as well. So this presentation is called In a Strange Land, and it's a title that I came across because of my interactions with survivors of suicide loss, and how over and over again they have gotten the point across that their loss leaves them feeling that they're aliens, that they're in a strange land, that everything that came before was different than what's now. And one of the survivors put it in a way that has stuck with me for so long. And they said it was like, they thought of it like everything was as if you came up to a period of a sentence. What was before was your life before, and everything after was a different sentence, a different story to tell. And often survivors talk about how they feel like an alien, they feel that they don't know where to turn. And so that's why this title, Being in a Strange Land, to me makes a lot of sense. But I also want to talk about meaning and resilience. And meaning and resilience after suicide loss, for me, is one of the untold, very, very often one of the untold stories that survivors of sudden loss, survivors of suicide loss. And I'm going to focus primarily on my experience with suicide and homicide loss because that's where I work. But a lot of the same things that I talk about can be applied to a lot of different sudden losses. And so I want to talk about meaning and resilience because that part of their story, a part of their journey, is the part that's so impactful when I witness it, that the process of discovering meaning and rediscovering, and I say rediscovering resilience because very often resilience is there. what's happening in their lives has complicated and made it difficult for them to connect to their strength, to their resilience. And so for me, seeing the process of discovering meaning after sudden loss, after sudden violent loss, and rediscovering resilience is a wonderful process to see. And it indicates a lot of the wonder of humankind that we're able to, despite the fact that we've been shattered, that we've lost our anchor in the world, so to speak, that we're able to move forward. And so that's a testament to the resilience that many people, and I'm not going to say all, but many people will be able to discover after a sudden loss. Before I go further, I want to talk about one of our volunteers for a second. I had met with some volunteers today, and I was reminded of this person's story. And and believe me, it's not a story that's easy to forget. This person has been volunteering with us close to 8 years now. She came to the program after the suicide loss of her first son, and so she was not living in Toronto. She came to the program, and she had told me after going through the program that she wanted to volunteer in our program as one of our peer facilitators. And she had applied to volunteer with us. The very day that she was submitting her application, she called me up to tell me that her second son had taken his life. And so you can imagine what that would be like to somebody to lose both their sons, their only children, to a suicide loss, and how broken somebody must be. And yes, she went through a process of feeling quite broken. She came back to our program, but what's amazing, as a again a testament to that sense of resilience is that 2 years, because we have a parameter that you can't apply as a volunteer until it's 2 years after your loss. 2 years to the day after her second son died, she called me up and said that she planned to volunteer. She planned to volunteer to become that support person, which would echo the support that she got. And really, that to me is an incredible sign of resilience. Um, and there's so many of them. There's so many stories of resilience that I've encountered, and a lot of that will form the backdrop to the real experiences, the real words of survivors, the real teachers for me are the survivors that come to our program. So for me, though, when I say that the pathway towards resilience is complicated, it's complicated especially because of what survivors go through. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the experience of survivors of traumatic loss as a way of understanding how difficult it is to feel resilient. The very fact that people will look at that R word, resilient, and say that they don't feel resilient, they don't feel strong. Uh, it makes a lot of sense because when you understand the experience that they're going through, it's a lot easier to understand why resilience often isn't even on the table, and yet it is eventually there. And so I want to talk a little bit about the experience of what survivors go through. And then I want to talk about resilience, and I want to talk about what we can do if we're giving care, if we're helping somebody through these kinds of losses, even just as we're not talking about a professional, but just somebody who is there to help somebody going through a sudden violent loss, what we can do to help them rediscover their sense of resilience. So first and foremost, what what survivors of traumatic loss experience is a profound sense of trauma. Um, and this is probably the single most important factor initially that needs to be considered as, in some ways, as a barrier to that sense of resilience. And so if you think about it, what is it like to experience the wound of a trauma that emerges after sudden loss? What is it like to experience something that's so unexpected, so violent, something that you're so unprepared for, that you struggle to cope with and something that you feel powerless about, you know, what is that like? And it's hard to know what that's like until you've been there, until you talk to somebody who's going through that. But when you look at the impact of trauma, the impact of trauma has both a short-term and a long-term impact. I'm just going to spend a little time talking about trauma, both in terms of the short-term sense of being numb and overwhelmed, of going on autopilot, and the longer-term feeling incapacitated, potentially being diagnosed with PTSD, and certainly affecting functioning. What's also important to know about trauma is that it affects every part of the person's life. And just if you look at this chart here, this chart, which is a snapshot of the impact of trauma of sudden loss in all areas of somebody's life. And one of the ones that, or two of the ones that stand out for me, one is how it affects somebody physically. And, you know, we really see that, you know, in terms of, you know, the impact on sleep, on the impact on concentration, sometimes aches and pains, high blood pressure, sometimes, you know, more severe physical impacts. And, you know, the other area that stands out a lot is the impact on on spirituality for survivors. And, you know, they've listed here, you know, anger at God and questioning of prior religious beliefs, but they also talk about lack of self-satisfaction. So it isn't just if somebody believes in God, but it's in more general spiritual values can be impacted. But everything else in somebody's life, interpersonally, how they function at work, everything is impacted by trauma. And so when you look at what's happening in somebody's life, again, it becomes easier to understand why resilience is often not even on the table. Um, and the other ways to look at trauma is that trauma impacts how the person can adapt to the loss, you know, how they can integrate the loss into their life. So what that refers to is a sense of how they can express, how they can access the narrative, talk about what happened, how they come to terms with the loss, and how they interact with other people. Another way to look at trauma is in terms of how it impacts the domains of the self. And what that refers to is something within traumatic loss of work that it impacts something called your assumptive world. And your assumptive world is shattered. So everything that you assumed to be right about the world, um, everything that you thought you knew very often comes into question. This phrase that your anchor is missing, to me, is a good way to put it. You know, when you think about losing, you know, a child or losing a spouse, whether it's sudden or not, but even more so if it's sudden and violent, when you think about that and think about how they are could be an anchor in your life, and when they're gone, though that everything that you believe, everything that you thought about comes into question. And resilience is very much connected to your beliefs about yourself. And so you need to wade through very often the impact that it has on your assumptive world in order to start putting the pieces of your life back together. So if your assumptions are shattered, you need to start putting something back together in order for resilience to emerge. And that's why trauma, the impact of trauma, becomes such an important consideration when looking at resilience in sudden loss. Another thing that is impacted by trauma is this when we talk about domains of the self, it's also impacting basic core values. And those basic core values are your sense of safety and trust, your sense of control, your sense of self-esteem, even your sense of intimacy. Those basic values, those basic needs, in fact, are are impacted by trauma. And again, when you see, you know, basic needs, basic core values being impacted by a sudden violent loss, it becomes easier to see why resilience is difficult. It's very difficult to feel resilient in that context. So again, it's about wading through, it's about going through the process of trying to reestablish a sense of control, a sense of safety, finding safety, is really critical before very often you can move to a feeling of resilience. And so the beginning part of understanding trauma becomes so critical here. The other things that it impacts is, beliefs about the person. There's an author that his name is Reinerson, and he talks about if you want to understand sudden violent death or suicide loss, you can look at it what he calls the three V's. And he talks about how much violence was there. So earlier when I talked about the course of trauma, whether it's short term or long term, the short term piece of how much violence there is can impact your longer term recovery. He also talks about how much violation, and that's where the violation of your assumptions. A good example of that is when parents say to me that their child shouldn't have died before them. You don't bury your child. That's a core assumption that parents often have about, life. And burying your child before you shatters a lot of those basic ideas about what's right in the world. The third V is how much volition, how much choice did the person have? And again, when you think about the violence, the volition, the violation, how much do we have to start wading through? How much do we have to start putting together again in order to start feeling resilient? And this is a way for us to understand the course of resilience after sudden loss by encountering and supporting somebody around trauma. This quote is written by Bessel van der Kolk, and he's one of of course, the well-known writers about trauma, and he talks about how trauma can turn the whole world into a gathering of aliens. One of the things that, and I'll talk about this later in terms of what helps when it comes to both resilience and sudden loss, is this idea that we need to access supports, we need to feel safe. And what he's saying here is that you don't often feel safe, and which makes a lot of sense because that core value of safety and trust has been shattered. And so how do you get through that piece where you're no longer seeing the world as a gathering of aliens? When you start feeling safe again, when you can start feeling a little more resilient. The second piece to consider is that sudden loss, no matter what kind, is a fundamental emotional journey at its core. Uh, so it's got that first part of the trauma. It's got the second part that survivors of sudden loss or sudden violent death encounter swings and huge swings and extremes of emotion. Um, Sometimes they'll encounter emotions that are so hard to manage that it's just always there in front of them. The ones that come up most commonly are these, at least within, especially with suicide loss, but it also comes up in other losses. And these emotions that people experience, guilt, regret, responsibility, feeling that you could have done more, um, is weighs so heavily on survivors. The one of the survivors that I worked with lost their only son, and they came for support. They came to all our support that we offer, and at the end of it, they still said that they felt they failed their son. And when you think about something like that, you realize that how hard it is, again, and I'm beating this drum a lot, how hard it is to feel resilient in the face of those weighing heavy feelings of guilt, regret, and responsibility. Lots of anxiety, um, panic attacks at times. Um, Anxiety often goes along with fear because a lot of times when you've lost somebody suddenly, you're afraid that somebody else in the room, somebody else in your home will do the same thing. And or you're afraid that somehow you will go down that path. It's not unusual for somebody to say that after losing somebody to suicide and they're trying to get in touch with somebody, they're calling them, they're texting them, and they're not answering, the first thing that comes into their head is this idea that maybe something bad has happened to them. And so this is in part an emotional reaction, but it's also connected to trauma, something that's called hypervigilance. And again, it's paralyzing. It's so hard to feel right when you're being paralyzed by these kinds of emotions. Extreme anger and rage, anger at the world, anger at the person who died, anger at the system, at doctors, at yourself for not having done the right things. Again, it's very paralyzing for a lot of survivors. Shame, um, connected, of course, to stigma, the feel that you could have done more and that you're being judged for it, and feeling that when you're backed into a corner, when you again go back to the impact of trauma, that sense of control that you don't have, a sense of being powerless, and then you're backed into a corner because of what you perceive as judgments. Again, it's very hard to move forward in that loss. Profound sadness. Um, it can be so overwhelming, um, and and yet, you know, we struggle being present with people's sadness, and yet we know that people need to express their pain. We acknowledge that grief is a love story very often. You wouldn't be grieving if you didn't love somebody so much. You wouldn't be grieving so profoundly, and yet somehow we struggle in the face of their sadness. And as a result, they struggle sometimes too, that they shouldn't be so sad or they're not grieving enough. And again, it makes it very complicated to move forward in life and emotional storms. And this is what is connected to a sense of triggers. People will call it either a grief loop or a roller coaster. And again, it's unpredictable very often, although arguably that you can start to predict triggers and do something about that, which is something that's worth exploring with them. At the same time, at the beginning, it feels very unpredictable. You feel a little bit better one day, a lot worse the next. And very often, survivors will say it's like taking one step forward and two steps back. They feel like every day is like ripping off a band aid again, that the pain starts over. And being immersed, as you can imagine, into this maelstrom of emotions, some of which feel no control over. It's just so difficult to feel strong. It's so difficult to feel that you can move forward and take a step forward in your loss. So, again, understanding the trauma and the emotional ride that survivors go through is a good way to understand why having conversations about resilience is so difficult. There's a few more things that help us understand the impact that are worth mentioning and will also impact the course of resilience. Um, Isolation and communication challenges especially after suicide loss and stigmatized losses. Um, there is, very often there are communication roadblocks with others. In part, it's not knowing what you can share or how to share it. Um, when you think about where most suicides happen, they don't, of course, most of them happen in a hospital where there's more care for the people left behind. Very often they happen in the home. And and if you can think of what that does to your life, how that complicates your life even further. But it's also very isolating because as we hear from survivors, they'll encounter people that don't know what to say or have stopped talking to them or that say very insensitive things. It's a challenging time to, as I say, walking on eggshells here. It's a challenging time when you're walking on eggshells. So in addition to everything that you're experiencing all these other things that is impacting your ability to move forward. And those things emerge in your social world. Um, it's hard to know, again, um, what supports are available and are you overburdening your local supports. And it's also, we're thinking about how survivors, especially of stigmatized losses, are treated by even professionals and first responders sometimes. Uh, Very often, a suicide can be considered a crime, until called not a crime. And so again, it adds to the level of complication and stigma that those survivors are experiencing. And so then you have your most immediate supports, which is your family. We also know that sudden violent deaths will impact family cohesion, how your family is coping. People grieve differently, different grieving styles, and it's hard within a family because those are the ones you're counting on the most when you're all needing to grieve and yet grieving differently. Uh, it was really interesting that I met with a couple not too long ago, and they were, both in the room, but not even really talking to each other. And it was very clear that one of them wanted to have some kind of a celebration of life, and the other one did not. One of them was connected to that they really wanted to move on and move forward, and the other one needed to spend more time mourning the loss. And they weren't hearing each other's different ways of grieving. And again, that was adding to their burden, that complication when it comes to sudden loss. Within families, there's often a different narrative about even about what happened. I had worked with a family, uh, a large family, in fact, that there was three children, two parents, and they had lost their fourth child. And one of the parents had said that they hadn't realized something about their child, and all the children knew it. So the children had a much different narrative about what happened, and the parents had no idea that that was happening in their child's life. And so it made it an interesting process that the people that you really were counting on for support because they were coming together, they were having struggles communicating over different perceptions of what happened. Families often have different ways of honoring the person. Um, Sometimes they'll want to um, have a celebration and some won't. Some will want to put it behind them and do nothing, as I was saying before. So different ways of honoring the person, and again, that can be very complicating. And again, the other things within families is how do you talk to children? How do you talk to other children, younger children, about sudden violent deaths? How do you talk to elderly parents? Because often people decide they don't want to tell their parents, who might be the grandparents of the person. And so what we're seeing is that, again, your local support system is being tremendously impacted after a sudden violent death. In addition to that, routines and roles are often changed. Adding to that, very often there's mental health concerns for the survivor. They may be pre-existing or they may emerge after the loss. And finally, there is within survivors of suicide loss, they are a group that are higher risk to attempt suicide as well. So the picture that I'm painting here is a very complicated picture for resilience to exist. A picture that includes many complicating factors, trauma, many challenging emotions, many challenging issues within their social circle. And yet, despite all that, despite that, what we see over and over again is that resilience emerges. And when we understand resilience, we can have helpful conversations with those survivors about resilience. So resilience, what is it? And this is an interesting question. Very often people will talk about it. It's your way of adapting to something. Uh, and I remember once putting this to a support group, and I wanted to introduce the topic of resilience to the group, and I asked them what resilience was, and people struggled with defining it. And so instead, I asked, well, how would you describe it in other words? And one of the descriptions that somebody said to me really stuck with me. And they saw resilience as, one of those trees that bends a lot in the wind, and it bends back and forth, but it doesn't break. And for them, that was a great way to picture resilience, that you will bend back and forth, but you won't break. And it's a way to understand how, despite circumstances that are enormously painful, that break a lot of people, that we're able to find a way not to fully break. And so that, for me, is a way to understand the process of resilience. And underlying that, what are the other factors that we can understand? Um, One of the useful ways to understand resilience is through the DBT framework, dialectical behavioral therapy. They provide a very interesting snapshot of the components of resilience. One of the first ones they talk about is a sense of mindfulness. Um, by being present and aware of what's happening around you, being able to understand the reactions and the emotional reactions that you're experiencing, be mindful of those. And that will contribute to another factor, which is their sense of how they can regulate emotions. By becoming more mindful of how it's impacting you inside, what reactions you're experiencing, being present with those and not judging those things, it's one of the starting points for emotion regulation. A second important point, that a way of understanding resilience is through relationships. Our ability to access support, our ability to understand that support is in fact available, and our ability to understand that sometimes we need to brainstorm about how we're interacting with people around us will contribute to our sense of well-being and our sense of resilience going forward, because it's through those relationships, and again, I'll talk about this later, it's through those relationships that we uncover a sense of safety. And safety is such a critical piece of recovering from traumatic losses, psychological safety. So emotion regulation and distress tolerance is another component within this framework. When we're really struggling and you go back to somebody feeling responsible for what happened, those thoughts are just there swirling around in your head. It's contributing to a lot of distress in your life. How do you tolerate those moments of distress? How do you manage those moments of distress? And it's by being able to both regulate your emotions, being mindful, and tolerating your distress that you begin to see a path towards feeling more resilient. The course of resilience. The course of resilience is predicted by a few things. One is the event itself. We know that suicide and homicide loss and other sudden losses, motor vehicle accidents, drug overdose, um, have an enormous impact because of the event itself. When I said earlier, the sense of violence in the event is a determining factor in recovery, very often a survivor will have found the body. They will have to perform CPR. They'll have to take the body down. And so how violent the event might have been will have an impact on the course of resilience because you need to get through those pieces first. Again, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Availability and accessing supports will impact the course of resilience and your past experiences. No losses exist in a vacuum. The context of the person's life, including past traumas, if somebody who is from the 2S LGBTQ plus community has experienced a suicide loss and they experience past trauma earlier in their life, even say to bullying in school, it's going to have the course of resilience and the course of trauma will have a much different effect than if those past experiences hadn't happened. Not all past traumas will be will have that negative impact on the current one because sometimes there's a lot of learning that can happen because of the previous traumas. And the learning that you might have had might contribute to your sense of resilience now. So, what are some helpful um, things that can contribute that are, say, personal resilience factors? One is something that's called creative problem solving. So, if you look at this chart, defining the problem, generating ideas, implement and evaluate and select solutions. Problem solving as a process can be a really helpful way towards feeling resilient, that you're actually going to get through this, that you're going to be able to adapt to what happened. It's also true that resilience is not a single skill. Uh, in addition to all the other things that I've been talking about, learning, developing coping skills, having reasonable goals um, that you can set for yourself, and setting healthy boundaries are all things that will contribute to a sense of well-being, a sense that you can get through this. And when you think about a definition of resilience, thinking that you can get through this is a good way to think about resilience. So setting reasonable goals. Um, it says here my 30-year plan is CEO, but next year I'm going to focus on walking. Trying to understand, as I said earlier, that sometimes it's about taking one step at a time for survivors. And that's a way to get through something. It's a way of adapting. One of the things that I hear over and over again is that we feel that somebody might not be resilient because they're not better. And yet what we're missing is that they're getting through it. And if somebody's taking one step at a time, in the face of such a traumatic loss, you think of that volunteer losing both her sons, taking one day at a time, to me, that's an incredible sign of resilience. She's focusing on walking instead of the 30-year plan of being a CEO. Self-care. Um, Self-care is an important part of resilience because the more we take care of ourselves, the more we can feel we can get through something. It's an activity that we do deliberately in order to care for our mental, emotional, and physical health. And this is an example of ways of looking at self-care and the various domains that we can explore with someone who's struggling with sudden loss, the various aspects of life. So we know that trauma and traumatic loss is a whole life impact. This is a way of looking at how we can look at self-care in those different areas. And by doing that, we're helping mitigate the impact of the trauma in various parts of their life. So there are many ways to cope. And And one of the things that helps us understand specifically suicide loss survivors is something called tasks of grieving. This is an early concept in bereavement developed by Warden, who talked about that people grieving a sudden loss or any loss will encounter a series of tasks that they need to accomplish in order to be able to move forward in their loss. I don't say getting over it, and I don't say closure, of course, because I'm not sure that exists. But certainly within the context of this, there are tasks. And so William Wharton talked about the 4 tasks of mourning within bereavement work that those grieving a sudden loss or any loss would need to address when going through that loss. One of the people working within suicide loss field has taken this idea and applied it to suicide loss. And he talks about different tasks of grieving a sudden violent death like suicide loss. He talks about needing to contain the trauma, needing to develop a narrative or to make sense of what happened, getting relief from the pain that you're experiencing. He calls it dosing the pain. Continuing a relationship with the person who died, and that's the remembering and honoring the person who died. And social considerations, how do you communicate the walking on eggshells phenomena? How do you navigate your social world? And reinvestment in living. These tasks are things that appear over and over again amongst those experiencing sudden violent death, like suicide loss. As survivors are beginning to navigate these different tasks and they begin to accomplish them to the degree they can, and everything varies from person to person, but as they're more able to contain the trauma, as they're more able to develop a narrative and make sense of what happened and get relief from the pain and develop a bond with the person who died and navigate their social world and reinvest in life, they feel very often more resilient, that they can get through it more completely. And looking at it from this perspective helps us understand that as survivors of sudden violent death are navigating their tasks, they're also moving towards a sense of a pathway through their loss. And that's what resilience implies. How do survivors uh, deal with sudden violent death? Survivors will find a way to cope, and they will develop what I call a coping repertoire, some of which is distraction, some of which is self-care, some of which is feeling that they can express their loss, and expression can come in many forms, finding connection, social support, and then finally finding meaning. I haven't talked about meaning, even though the original title of this talk was meaning. And I haven't talked about it yet because meaning is one of the later processes that survivors often experience. And this is the process of uncovering how you changed, what's different now. There's a concept called post-traumatic growth, which implies how survivors change over the course of time during their dealing with sudden violent death. And you'll see this and it is reflected in things like taking on new roles, sometimes becoming a volunteer, sometimes starting a foundation. They will take on new roles as a way of giving meaning to their loss. All of these things, the way they're coping, the way they take care of themselves, navigating their social world and finding meaning are dramatic signs that resilience is occurring. How we can help. Starting with this, that one size doesn't fit all. We know that we want to think that people grieve the same, that we can apply an algorithm to grief. And we know clearly, and that's a little tongue in cheek, but the truth is that we need to fully understand that one size doesn't fit all. That what may be a course of resilience for another doesn't work the same for somebody else. And our assumptions about that are something that we need to consider when we're helping somebody. We also need to think about for the person is where is safety? Where can the person encounter safety? We know that when you're dealing with trauma, the single most important thing is to find safe spaces. that you can unload some of what you've been dealing with, that you can explore and get support and learn how to cope with some of what you've been dealing with. Trauma, we know, has an enormous neurophysiological effect, and we know that in the context of finding safety, we know that the body begins to adapt to the trauma. So what we can do is we can be co-creators of safe spaces for them. We can learn a language of care and support within that safe space that will help them begin to navigate their loss. You don't need to be a grief therapist. You don't need to be a psychologist. We can be a safe space for someone. And yes, it is good to know about those complications and to refer people if we need to for trauma support. If there's risk involved, know where we can refer them to. But being a safe space is a great place to start as well, so that they can begin to unload and begin to move towards that sense of resilience. Some of our roles are um, recognizing the impact of trauma, and when doing so, uh, it's it's recognizing that first and foremost in a traumatic loss, that we need to help the person contain the trauma. And it's very hard to move into those other parts of mourning, the tasks of grieving that Jordan talked about, if the trauma isn't contained. How we communicate with somebody, good active listening skills, the power of witnessing and presence, psychoeducation if needed. We can help them understand how trauma affects them, and something called co-regulation. Being in the same space with somebody where we're regulated in the context of their trauma can often contribute to their sense of being regulated. So I want to end by talking about this, that trauma is like a hurricane and grief is like the weather. A trauma is so powerful, but for most people find a way to contain it, to come to terms with it, and to find a course of resilience after their trauma. Grief, though, is like the weather because it's always there. And we need to be okay with that if we're caring for somebody who's grieving. That the grief doesn't necessarily follow a timeline that we want it to. We need to be patient, compassionate. We need to reflect the kindness of the world if we're caring for somebody. I also say that when you're not sure what to say nothing. There's no substitute for compassion, patience, and empathy. It lets somebody know that there's more in the world than loss. Most survivors have a capacity to weather the storm. With patience, trust, and empathy, we can effectively collaborate and help them return to their strengths, which is a sign of their resilience, and help them in that process of meaning making after their loss. Meaning making and resilience are longer term processes after traumatic loss very often, but they do come and we do need to honor and recognize them, that they're even happening in the smallest moments. If somebody is reaching out and they say that, I think that I'm able to have one day where I'm not thinking about it, imagine the victory that is for that person. Imagine when they've lost their spouse who they've been with for 35 years, and they say that when they woke up, they had one day that they didn't think about how tragic the suicide was for them. What a victory that is, and what a sign of resilience that is. And so we need to honor the small steps of resilience that take place. We don't need somebody to get back to their normal life right away because that's not going to happen. But the small steps are beautiful and we need to recognize them. I want to return once more to that volunteer. So we saw that she lost both her sons, and yet she wanted to come back and volunteer, which was a longer process, and that was about making meaning. Today, when I was talking to her, she talked about how a little bit later it was her sense of humor that started to get her through. And people would look at her strange because she would crack the oddest jokes at the oddest times, the darkest kind of humor, but it was getting her through. Again, this is a sign of how we can understand resilience and how it's not the same for everyone. Humor is one of those factors in resilience that is not well understood, but it very often is there. And for this volunteer, it was there and it emerged later. So, like a lot of these things, we see that it's that early part that is really hard because of the trauma, the emotional component, the other complications, and then resilience, meaning emerges as it did with this volunteer. And so recognizing that and honoring that is really good. And this volunteer continues to be a regular contributing volunteer to this day. It's what gives her meaning. So I want to end there. I want to end by recognizing um, our volunteers and the work that they do, and they've done it through COVID, and how, for me, it really does say what an amazing world it is. Despite the incredible losses that we've experienced during COVID, we still see people getting through it, and we still see volunteers doing this incredible work. So I want to honor them for that and their resilience. And I want to thank you for being able to present this.
Hello, Alex. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Um, we'll go ahead and enter the Q&A portion of the webinar. We'll reserve around 10 minutes for that if you don't mind. I know we'll be going a little bit over. I just want to give anybody the chance to ask a question. We'll ask them to Alex. Please put them in the Q&A box if you can so that I see them so that I can ask Alex. And as a reminder, if we don't get to your questions today, please email us at programs@abmf.charity and we can get back to you as soon as possible.
And I just want to say one thing that I was a little bit wary of the time. And so there was a couple of slides there that I didn't address, but you will have the slides. So
Yes, thank you so much for that important reminder. Yes, the slides will be made available to you, as will the recording. It'll be on the ABMF charity YouTube channel. We did receive a couple of questions in advance, so maybe I'll ask you just a couple of those and we'll see if anybody present would like to ask you a question. And then we can end the webinar from there and see what happens. One of the questions we received, one of them was about feelings of anger. And let me just find the question. Yes, okay, so it was a question of losing a family member in an accident. It was, they understand it was no one's fault, it was an accident, but they say, but I feel so angry towards the driver, the other driver, I assume. How do you feel with the anger?
So my approach to difficult emotions, first and foremost, is to validate those emotions. And very often people feel that their emotions aren't being validated, aren't being, in a sense, honored. If somebody is responsible for you losing somebody so close, anger makes a lot of sense to me. And and as I said, within suicide loss, it's the same thing. You could be angry at the person who died or at yourself or at the medical system. Anger to me is one of those emotions that needs to be expressed. So within an emotion regulation context, for instance, though, it's, the fact that you've recognized it. The next thing is to understand how how is it being expressed in your life? And so it's not so much that there's anything wrong with the anger. The question is, okay, the anger is present. We recognize now how is it being expressed and are we targeting other people, for instance? Because very often when we're dealing with anger, it can be one of those free floating things that ends up targeting people close to us. And so that's not usually helpful. In fact, I don't think it's ever helpful. And so the question then becomes, is there another way for us to explore and deal with our anger that isn't going to be doing that. So it isn't about taking it away, because anger can be, first of all, anger can actually be quite amazing in all honesty. I've talked to so many people where anger will get them out of bed, because it is a propelling kind of emotion, but it also needs to be recognized. And then, okay, what's the course of anger in your life? And are you struggling with that? Because I'm not judging how anger is happening in your life. For me, that's not the issue. The issue is, are you having difficulty with it? And if you're having difficulty with it, let's look at that and let's see, is there something else that can be happening? Do you do you have an understanding of the anger, which again, emotion regulation 101 is, do we understand where it's coming from? Do we understand where it's going? And are you struggling with those components? And if you are, let's look at those. But it's not about saying that anger needs to be taken away. That's my approach to anger.
That's really great. Thank you so much for answering that question. Let me ask a couple of more questions that we received via email. Worst case, we can get back to them directly because we have time. So one more question is about the lack of, I'm just trying to summarize them, is a lack of understanding after a loss. I still don't understand how they could have done that. I want to let go, but I keep asking myself questions about it, wondering how they can work through this.
Yeah. There's no doubt that gaining an understanding, or what I would call your narrative, um, a narrative that makes sense to you. My recognition is that you're never going to have a full understanding about what happened. I mean, you take suicide as an example, there's so many pieces of information that you'll never have. And so it's going to be very hard. So, my thing is that very often survivors become private detectives. They will try and figure something out until they stop figuring it out. Again, I don't judge that. If somebody loses a child to suicide and they're trying to put the pieces together, who am I to judge how long they're going to try and understand it? It's their loss, it was their child. It's their grief. But very often we struggle as seeing somebody doing that because it's, well, they're not moving forward. Okay, that's one piece of it. For the person, and if they're struggling with it, the challenge becomes, how do you put together enough of a story, enough of a narrative for now, knowing that it's not complete or may never be complete, that allows you to say, okay, this is what I know and this is what I don't know, but I need to be okay with that. I need to find a way to be okay with that in order for me to re-engage with life. Because you remember, one of those tasks of grieving was re-engaging with your life is one of those critical tasks that survivors of sudden loss deal with. How do we start becoming part of the social world again? You know, um, how do we start going out to functions again? How do we do those things when we don't feel like it? So how do we start doing that? And very often that there's in fact a very good article that was called From Sense Making to Meaning Making as a Process when it comes to sudden loss. So we start with needing to make sense of it, and we then move towards making meaning of it as a process. And in between, a lot of things happen. But that making sense of it is can be short, it can be long. But some of it is that internal process of recognizing that there's pieces that I don't know, and I need to be okay with that. And that's a struggle. It's a struggle with loss of people that are close to us. And sometimes, in all honesty, when you think about coping, for instance, so let's say we're dealing with something that's really difficult, like not understanding what happened, and it's just there all the time. I don't understand what happened. Another example is guilt. I'm just feeling guilty all the time, and it's just swirling around inside my head. And and yes, it's great to talk about it and to process it. That's true. But sometimes you also need to just distract yourself from it. So there is different things to consider, like, yes, process and talk about it, talk it through, because that might help get that cognitive internal script going around what happened. And when that's not good enough, how can I distract myself from this? Because sometimes you just can't be doing that all the time. And so that will help alleviate some of that anxiety as well. And with time and a little bit of other circumstances connecting to your social world, some of that just may stabilize. So there's a few different things that can be at work here when it comes to not having that full story or narrative about what happened.
Okay, thank you so much. There was a question about guilt that you kind of touched upon there. So I'd like to end with this question because you kind of touched about the perspective of other people and their reaction to those who have lost someone suddenly. So the question is, my friend lost someone important recently to a sudden illness. How can I help them in their grieving journey?
There's a few different things that are good to keep in mind. One person, I'm sure that's um, I'm sure that you've probably heard this before, but one of the phrases that has come up to me is be available but not intrusive. Um, and so that's one of the keys. Recognizing that good communication skills are never going to be replaced if recognizing that. So I have something that I call the three V's. There's a different set of three V's than the earlier one. When I'm training volunteers, it's a new set of three V's, which is validate, validate, validate. When you're supporting somebody going through something, always fall back on those good communication skills, validating, conveying empathy, recognizing that your presence is critical here. And I talked a little bit really quickly about co-regulation, being present in the space and being a witness to what happened and being honest, not knowing what they need. And I don't know many survivors I've worked with, and I have to say that each time I go into space, I have no idea what they need. And so one of the core values that I have is that the only expert in the room is them because it's their loss and it's their experience. And so we need to spend a lot more time asking rather than teaching. And so if we ask and we acknowledge that, in all honesty, I don't know, I've never been through this. But if you do it in a way that is so full of empathy and compassion, it'll probably come across okay. If you say to somebody, I see that you're hurting so much right now. I want to be there for you. In all honesty, I'm not sure what to do, but please let me know what I can do. If you say that, people will very often respond okay to that. We don't need to be an expert. The area of grief therapy and counseling is a very recent field. And I have to say, a lot of it has emerged because people feel disempowered about helping people around them. So grief has moved, which used to be so in our midst, it now becomes so isolated in the realm of therapists and professionals. We've forgotten that just as who we are, being genuine, having that genuine component and care for that person and asking, goes a long way. It's we don't need to be a professional or therapist for that.
Thank you so much, Alex. All right, we'll end it there for today. Thank you for coming in. The work you do is very, very, very important, and we appreciate you sharing this with us. And thank you for everyone who joined us today and for participating in this discussion in your own way by being present. We appreciate you being here, and remember to follow the Ashley Boca Mindfulness Foundation on social media and check out our website for future webinars and events. So please be well and stay safe.